by the Inequality Program at the Kennedy School. Our speaker today, as you know, is Kirabo Jackson from Northwestern. And Bo, just looking around the room, I think is just a testament to the level of interest and the kind of work that you do here at HGSC and at Harvard. So
received.
Yeah. So the Bo has worked in two main areas. Many of you probably know his research on teacher effects, using different kinds of outcomes, measuring the effects of teachers on outcomes, and then looking at complementarities, teacher effectiveness within schools. But a second area where he and his co-authors are really making important contributions that he'll be talking about today is the relationship between school spending, school finance reforms, and now Head Start spending, and income inequality among adults. So, Bo, thank you for coming and speaking to us today. I'm going to pass around some candy that the prior class left for us. I don't know if we're going to have enough to get the whole room, but we might as well, get started.
So thank you for the introduction. I used to hand out candy when at the end of teaching for the semester before students did their evaluations, and I think it helped. So you guys will hopefully think I do a good job here. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here.
I should have let you handle it.
No, that's right. I'm getting none of the credit. But yeah, so the title of the talk is Reducing Inequality Through Dynamic Complementarity. And this is joint work with Rucker Johnson at UC Berkeley. And just to give a very brief overview, what we're doing here is we're sort of asking the question, to what extent does increasing investments in early childhood education and investments in K-12 education, to what extent are those two things complementary to each other? Or in other words, to what extent is the combined effect of those two things larger than the sum of the individual component parts? So by way of motivation, we sort of know through a variety of sets of studies that children who are born to less advantaged households and communities, they tend to experience lower levels of education, employment, earnings, and health and well-being when they're adults. There's also another set of studies that document that some of these disparities that we observe between those from advantaged and disadvantaged homes starts pretty early. Sometimes you can see these things documented as early as like age 3, and sometimes even earlier. So you might think that if you want to sort of break the cycle of disadvantage where children from disadvantaged homes as children end up being disadvantaged themselves when they're older, you might want to start early and can sort of start early investing in the skills of disadvantaged children and then follow that up with sustained investments over time. The other sort of motivation is somewhat more theoretical, which is that policies may interact. So in principle, the effect of early childhood interventions on long-run outcomes might actually depend on the subsequent investments that kids are exposed to in the K-12 system and vice versa. So for those of you who might be familiar with the Head Start literature, it's been sort of well documented that the children who benefit most from Head Start tend to be children from more affluent, or the more affluent of the low-income children. They found sort of small effects for African-American children, large effects for white children. One of the potential explanations for that is that the white children attended K-12 schools that were sort of better resourced and were better able to sustain the gains made in the Head Start program. And theoretically, Jim Heckman and co-authors have been making the argument that if we have these complementarities between investments over time, early and later investments, then the first thing is that early human capital investments are going to make subsequent investments more productive, which is to say that you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck when you spend money in the K-12 system if you have good amounts of spending in the early childhood system. And then the opposite is going to be true. Early human capital investments may actually be relatively ineffective if they're not followed up by subsequent investments. So you sort of make these gains, but you don't sustain them over time. They might go away. And then third is that it turns out you can sort of justify policies that redistribute resources towards disadvantaged children, away from more advantaged children, potentially without having to appeal to sort of equity grounds. So I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but arguably, if the complementarities are large enough, you could actually justify taking money away from more affluent districts and spending it on early childhood education, and you could actually increase overall educational attainment at the same time that having more equitable outcomes at the same time. So those two things don't necessarily have to be in conflict. But I think politically is really helpful if you don't have to appeal to other things. But I should just say very clearly that policies need not necessarily be complementary to each other. It is entirely possible that two policies that promote human capital are substitutes for each other. So you can imagine a scenario where if you have a compensatory program that's designed to improve the outcomes of children who are behind, then in that case, you're going to have bigger impacts for people who are behind versus those that weren't exposed. So it's not obvious that necessarily going to be complementary. They could be substitutes as well. So what we're going to do is the following. So we're going to study the interaction between the impacts of two large human capital policy interventions. The first is going to be Head Start, and the second is going to be K-12 spending. Then we're going to basically track the long-run outcomes of individuals who are of school and preschool age during the rollout of these two large interventions, and we're sort of adults in 2005, and we're going to analyze their adult outcomes. So we're going to use the rollout of Head Start as a shock to early childhood education. So Head Start first started in 1965, and I'll give you some more detail about that in a moment. And we're basically going to compare the outcomes of children who were of age 4 prior to 1965 and of age 4 after 1965. And we're going to compare the outcomes of children who are exposed to Head Start to those that were not. We're going to use two different approaches, which I'll talk about. And then to identify the effects of spending in the K-12 system, which is going to be for children between the ages of 5 and 17 years old, we're going to use court-ordered school finance reforms, and I'll go into much greater detail about those as well. As a quick summary of them, basically, starting in 1972, many states passed laws requiring there to be greater equity in public school spending between school districts that spent very little and school districts that spent a lot. So these two things basically make it such that depending on where a child was born and their age at which they were, well, the time they were born and the location that they were born, they were either exposed to a Head Start shock, which is exposure to Head Start, or they were exposed to a school finance reform that increased the level of K-12 spending they were exposed to, and some people were exposed to both. And the question is the effect for those that are exposed to both policies larger than the sum of the individual parts? And the short answer is yes. So there is some related work that I should talk about. I should also just mention we are playing, I think, economist rules. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to just chime in. I'm more than happy to engage with that. Okay, so related work. Some scholars have examined whether human capital interventions vary by pre-intervention skills. So you sort of ask the question, if you enter kindergarten earlier, do you benefit more from kindergarten than if you enter later? That's not exactly the same thing that we're asking. We're asking whether two actual interventions themselves interact with each other, but they're obviously clearly related, because obviously if an early intervention raises your skills, then we're sort of asking a related question, but not exactly the same thing. So a bunch of papers that examine questions of that nature. There's a paper here by Eisner and Kuna that look at whether being in Head Start, whether the children who enter Head Start with higher levels of skills benefit more from Head Start. There are other sets of studies that sort of examine the benefits of human capital interventions among those that were exposed to some kind of shock. So you might ask the question, do you benefit more from going to a better school if you were exposed to a hurricane when your mom was pregnant? That kind of thing. Again, it is examining the interaction between two shocks, but one of those shocks is not really a policy shock. So it's interesting theoretically, but doesn't necessarily speak directly to policy. And there are a few studies that actually examine two policies themselves. One of them is looking at whether children benefit from going to a better school if abortion was legalized when they were conceived, and they sort of examine that question. And there are others that ask the question of whether access to preschool was larger or smaller among those that had access to home medical visits during infancy. So there's relatively few papers that examine two policies. It's actually really hard to credibly say, well, the interaction between two policies is positive or negative because it requires that you can identify the effect of one policy. It requires that you can identify credibly the effect of the other policy, and then you have to also be able to argue that the interaction between the two is credibly identified as well. I'm going to go through some pains to try and show that to be the case here, but it's actually relatively difficult. And there are very few papers that have done it. I know of only one that has examined two education-type policies, and basically it's a really nice paper by Gilrain, who basically documents that children who are exposed to test-based accountability in grades 3 and grades 4 have better outcomes than those who are exposed to just grade 3 or grade 4. The combined effect is quite good as well. So, theoretically, it's important to sort of think about why might these two policies interact. Why would pre-K, designed for sort of low-income children between the ages of 3 and 4, interact with spending in the public education system for children between the ages of 5 and 12? So, basically, we argue there are going to be two distinct channels through which these policies may interact. So the first is what I call the direct channel. And we're going to call it sort of the alignment channel. The basic idea here is that the K through 12 system is designed in a particular area, the district or the school, is designed to be targeted for a particular kid that comes in with a particular preparation level. What Head Start potentially does is it raises the incoming skill level of the children to that closer to the target. And if the closer the kid is to the target, the more they benefit from the K through 12 system. So if Head Start basically is going to improve outcomes by raising the level of disadvantaged children who are most likely to be below that target so that they can benefit from the K through 12 system. So their ability level is better aligned with that the instruction is going to be targeted. So we call this the alignment channel, and this is sort of the first direct channel. So this is very similar to the sort of skills begets skills argument that Heckman and co-authors have raised. The idea here being that if you have the skills required to understand the next topic, you're going to benefit more from that. And you can think of, when we learn math, how this sort of works. You have to learn how to do addition before you can do multiplication, for example. Without doing addition, you can't do the other. There's an order through which knowledge is acquired, and you can't benefit from the instruction if you're not sort of at that level. So another implication of this is that if the K through 12 system is of low quality, there could be fade-outs. You can imagine a scenario where if the K through 12 system is low quality, they may target instruction at a very low level. Head Start could actually potentially raise the incoming skills of the children above the target of the K through 12 system, and in which case they're actually moved farther away from the target than they were before, but they're moved in the opposite direction. So in that case, if you were to test them, you might see their test scores are really good relative to those who are in the traditional public schooling system, but their test scores would basically converge to that of those in the regular system, and you would get something that looks exactly like the test score fade-out that have been documented in many studies of early childhood interventions. So there are also going to be potentially indirect channels. So the first indirect channel is going to be through what we call spillover effects. The basic idea here is that Head Start, when it comes into a community, is going to improve the skills of many children, not just the child who's in Head Start, but also other children in the same community. When it comes in, it's targeted to poor children in a county. Even if I myself, I'm a child, same with child, even if I myself do not participate in Head Start, all my classmates may participate in Head Start, and if Head Start leads to sort of improved behaviors or improved cognitive skills, it may be the case that I'm going to benefit from the positive behaviors of my peers such that my outcomes improve as well. So what you may observe is that that the K through 12 system could actually be more effective when you have cohorts of children who come in with better preparation because they can sort of leverage that information. And that's distinct from the direct channel. This is sort of a spillover channel. And then the second indirect channel is what we sort of call adjustments. The idea here is that when the incoming cohort of children who are exposed to Head Start suddenly hits the K through 12 system, the K through 12 system may do some adjustment to their instruction to better account for what's going on among the kids. And these adjustments could actually lead to negative effects as well. So you can imagine a scenario where a whole bunch of children come in, maybe half the population is exposed to Head Start, half of them is not. The teacher decides to adjust her instruction up to the level of the new level of kids that are exposed. If I'm not exposed to Head Start, I'm actually left further behind than I was before, and I can actually be sort of hurt by this intervention. But if I'm one of the kids who participate, I actually benefit from that. The adjustments can lead to effects that can either be positive or negative. It's unclear what's going to be. So, yeah.
But one thing I was wondering about is why do you make a distinction between the alignment channel and the learning begets learning theory? I know you're sort of describing this as the skills beget skills, or the learning begets learning as a subset of that. But why draw the distinction?
I mean, the way that we think about it is that, so the skills beget skills idea, exactly, we think of this as being a subset of the direct channel. I guess to some extent, we're just kind of, I think people have a very distinct model in mind when they think of skill beget skills. They think of like, well, I cannot know, like I said, I can't understand multiplication until I know addition. Right. People have that sort of idea in mind, which is somewhat different from the idea that like the alignment. So that's really the distinction. But conceptually, they're very good. Yeah.
I mean, the skills beget skills has trouble with the fade outs.
With the,
It's
I
hard
think
to reconcile the skills beget skills with the fade out.
That's right.
But
it can be
direct
reconciled.
channel,
It can be reconciled but it can be reconciled if you imagine a scenario where if the reason for the skill beget skills is that the kid is closer to the target. Now what's going to happen is the kids who are in Head Start, if the target in the K-12 system is really low, let's say in a poorly provided school, then they're just coming in and they're just they're not being tested, and everyone is learning the skills that they would have learned, and then they sort of catch up.
Yeah. So the alignment channel.
Yes, explains the fade out.
Explains the fade out.
In a way that skills in a way that skill begets skills on its own does not.
Right.
That is correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So you mentioned the second indirect channel as adjustments. So you gave the example of adjustments within a class across students who may have participated or not participated. There could also be school adjustments across cohorts.
Yes.
So you had mentioned that maybe you were just giving this to us as intuition to compare fourth graders who were 4-year-olds just before and after. That seems like it would be most subject to the potential threat of schools making adjustments if they said to themselves, like, shoot, we got this new cohort of kids coming in who all went through Head Start. We got to move our best teachers to that cohort.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that would be another channel, and you can imagine. So I hadn't thought of the teacher sorting, but absolutely, I was thinking even just things like, well, now we have fewer behavioral problems. Yeah. Let's get rid of our guidance counselor and hire something. Yeah, exactly. And that could influence people who are 12th graders at the same time in the school system through sort of basically a budgetary spillover. So conceptually, it need not be the kids who are in the same classroom at all. It could be kids who are just in the same schooling system at that same point in time. So empirically, we're going to basically show you that's not important for our results, but conceptually, it's certainly a possibility. Yeah.
To Tom's question, too, like another reason why we might want to distinguish with the skills beget skills too is for automatic promotion, because if there's like a certain skill level that you need to get through, like if it's skills beget skills, then this could have like a policy implication of like helping us to think about like how do these dynamic complementarities impact students getting to the next grade if we do these things.
Right.
I wanted to ask too, like, where would parental crowd out or crowd in like figure into this story?
That's one of these two. So that's precisely what we had in mind. The other one we thought of is, well, parents may decide. Again, it could go in either direction. Oh, well, now my kid is in this awesome Head Start program. I'm no longer going to read them bedtime stories. Or it could be, oh, they're now in this awesome Head Start program. That's really fantastic. I'm going to start making sure they do their homework when they enter kindergarten, and it could go in the opposite direction. So these adjustments could also go up or down, and there's no real necessarily easy way to tell that apart. We're going to show you some evidence that parents' quality does not appear to be an issue. I'll just summarize it very quickly. Basically, you can look at families, and we can identify siblings in our data. So you can ask the question, if you are, say, too old to participate in Head Start, but your youngest sibling does that influence your outcomes at all? And the answer there is no. So we don't think that's the channel. But that would fall under the sort of parental differences.
And you will look at family structure as well, too, like whether I'm from a single parent family or not.
We don't look at that specifically.
Okay. That'd be an interesting way to look at this as well, too, right?
Right. I think we could. We did not, but we could. Okay, so just to give you a very quick preview of the results, what we find is that among poor children, access to a typical Head Start center is going to, and increased K-12 spending, each individually lead to improved high school graduation, years of education, adult wages, and adult incarceration. And we find significant evidence of dynamic complementarity between pre-K spending, specifically Head Start spending, and K-12 spending. And to just sort of put these numbers into context, we find that the marginal effect of Head Start is basically twice as large if K-12 spending is 10% above the average compared to when it was 10% below the average. So the marginal effect is pretty big, and we actually find that in many cases, if they're exposed to Head Start and K-12 spending levels that are 10% below average, the impact of Head Start is actually very, very small, and oftentimes can't be distinguished from zero. Okay, so talking about the data. So the first thing we have to do is we have to link schools and counties to adult outcomes. So our data set is a panel study of income dynamics. We tracked individuals who were born between 1950 and 1976 and followed up through 2015. So we observed them when they were adults, and we're going to look at their outcomes between the ages of 25 and 45. So we're going to observe their outcomes between 1980 and 2015. So the data are linked to census blocks at birth, and then to districts and counties. This is important because our school spending variation is going to vary at the school district level, and Head Start variation is going to be varying at the county level. But in most cases, counties, and once you control for districts, you sort of control for counties as well in those contexts. So the resulting sample, we have about 15,232 children. We use what is commonly referred to as a poverty sample, which oversamples families from low-income backgrounds. And we have all person-year observations for individuals between 20 and 45. In the data, this is about 6,400 low-income children. And as a minor technical issue, so we define low income as being in the bottom quartile during the ages of 12 and 17. So we have to do this because in our data, we don't necessarily observe everyone at age 4. So one of the key things is Head Start eligibility is based on your parental income at age 4. But for the later cohorts, we observe them at age 4. But for those that enter the data basically at age 5 or 6, we only know what their parents earn when they enter the data. So we have to sort of do a little bit of backcasting here, and we use how much the parents earned when the individuals were between 12 and 17, and figured out, based on that, the likelihood that they were poor, and we basically figured out that if you're in the bottom quartile during these ages, you're very likely to be poor. So using the data where we do have the after poverty data, we catch about 80% of those who are below the poverty line using this measure. Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. So, what kind of response rates by age 20 or 45 does the PSID achieve for people for whom it observed the birth? So like, you see what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
what
yeah,
was
yeah.
the cumulative response rate?
So this is a question that I have. So Rucker's the one who knows the PSID inside and out. I'm not the PSID guy, but the wave response, I know the PSID was really expensive, and the response rate, the attrition rate was very, very low.
From 1 year to the next.
That's
but I
right.
was just wondering, like,
Cumulative.
yeah.
So in one of the appendices in the paper, we did do that analysis. Specifically, we also examined whether that varied by Head Start status, and it did not. But the cumulative amount, I'm not sure. The number I have in my head is somewhere in the 80% range. But don't quote me on that. I'd have to do that up. But it definitely does not vary with Head Start status or K-12 status, which is, I think, important for the credibility of the results. Okay, so the data, the PSID data, once we link it to school districts, it covers about 1,400 school districts. This is roughly 10% of all public school districts in the country, across about 1,000 counties across all 50 states. We link it to Head Start program funding data that are available between 1965 and 1980. And then we link it to school finance reform data and K-12 spending data between 1967 and 1990. We don't look past 1990 because the individuals we're looking at are adults at that point, so we don't get anything beyond that. So to give you a bit of background on Head Start, so Head Start was established in 1964 as part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. It's a national, federally funded program designed to improve the human capital, that is sort of just the skills that children have, of poor preschool-age children. So it included a few important components. People often think about it as being primarily an educational intervention. It certainly is that, but it did have some important components such as health. So one of the components was educational efforts for both parents and children to enhance nutrition in the home, and also providing nutritious meals for the children while they're in the Head Start Center. They also included health and developmental screenings and programs to connect families with medical and dental care and mental health services if the child needed additional help. And then the key thing that most people sort of think about is it also had curriculum to enhance literacy, numeracy, reasoning and problem solving, and decision making skills. So one thing here to also focus is that it's not just about literacy and numeracy skills. They also focused on sort of these softer non-cognitive skills such as reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. And there are some people who would argue that many of the successful pre-K programs, the reason they are successful is through these sort of non-cognitive measures. And this is something that was a key component here as well. So actually I went back to the original sort of drafting documents when Head Start was first rolled out, and they were actually very, very thoughtful about the kinds of things they wanted to do. It was designed to be very comprehensive, to think of the child as being exposed to things in the home and in the schooling environment. They really tried to make sure that the child was healthy, they got stimulation both in a cognitive sense, also in a non-cognitive sense, that their parents were on board. And part of the last component of this was actually some parenting strategies, basically for first-time parents, to ensure that when the child went home from the center, the parents were able to sort of sustain the things that were going on in the center as well.
So should we think about this as like the Harlem Children's Zone, but like in the sense that it's kind of like a whole package?
Certainly it's a package. I don't know that I would consider it quite as comprehensive as the Harlem Children's Zone, but I think it's a very similar idea that you're sort of tackling the whole child, and it's not just basic, cognitive skills. It's really a package deal. And for certainly there were some health interventions as well involved in this.
And was there variation in terms of like which of those components in that bundle was offered, or was it offered kind of uniformly by place?
So I think there's a lot of variation in what was offered. So in the very, very beginning, things were not systematized in the way that it is today, and it's very difficult to get information on that. You probably attest to that. So what we do know is whether a center existed, and we know how much they spent. So we can sort of infer that if you spent more money on a per-child basis, you probably offered more of these services, but beyond that, that's just not information that we have, unfortunately. But it would be awesome to be able to sort of disentangle this thing and even figure out which one of these components is the one that's leading to the complementarity. That would be fantastic to do, but sadly, the data are very, very old. That's just what it is. So to be eligible for Head Start during the period, Head Start was aimed at children between the ages of 3 and 5. Most participants in the data were about 4 years old. It was designed and was targeted to families who were at or below the federal poverty line. There were a few exceptions, so every Head Start center had to have 90% of the enrollees in the center be below the federal poverty line. The other 10%, they actually were thinking that you want to actually have some positive peer effects, so they were allowed to admit some families that were above the poverty line. They also had provisions to allow individuals with disabilities to be enrolled as well. But for the most part, it was based on the poverty line. Head Start expenditures on average were about $8,500 per child. Today, and roughly at the time period in the study, in the sort of the 70s, it was about $5,600 per enrollee, and this is in 2014 dollars. As a sort of just a contextual note, these levels of spending are much lower than what you observe in like preschool or Abecedarian, which are much larger programs. Some of these programs lasted for multiple years, and they spent maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times as much per child. So this is a much more modest pre-K program. So insofar as we find some positive impacts here, that's actually kind of encouraging. Okay, so this is just showing you what Head Start enrollment looked like over time. So Head Start, when it was first introduced, was actually a summer-only program. So it basically rolled out in the summer of '65, and the following year they introduced a sort of full-year Head Start, which was offered for basically full year. So as you can see, the first few years of Head Start, most of the enrollment that one observes is actually in the summer-only program. And then by sort of 1970, the full-year program essentially takes over, and that's where most of the enrollment is. But the first thing to sort of note, which you're going to see crop up in a few figures, is that you see this big spike in enrollments during the summer-only period. and it sort of transitions out. It turns out this accounts for an enormous share of income eligible children. So at first when we saw the numbers, we're like, this can't be right. But it turns out that it seems as though about 80%, maybe like 85% of income eligible children during that first summer was actually participating in Head Start. So almost every poor child basically was enrolled in some Head Start program, probably the summer only program. But then it tapers off. So this is basically showing you, the other thing I wanted to mention is that, again, by way of context, this is just showing you the percent of 3 and 4-year-olds who are in full-time daycare. As you can see, prior to the rollout of Head Start, almost no one was in full-time daycare. So the counterfactual essentially is some kind of, some kind of care, probably in the home, or some other informal situation like a grandparent or a family member. We're not talking about Head Start versus some other kind of commercial childcare situation. That is not going to be true today. Now that number is very different. Now when we look at sort of things like universal pre-K, we're potentially comparing universal pre-K to some other pre-K situation. So if you just look at Head Start enrollment over time, this is where we basically take the data and figure out, roughly speaking, what fraction of income eligible children would likely have been enrolled in Head Start at some point between the ages of 3 and 5. Our estimate is that that number initially jumped to about 80–85%, and then basically dropped as the summer-only program was phased out, and then there was sort of a renewal of Head Start in the early 90s, and now we're looking at about 2/3, which is the estimate that most people sort of know about 2/3 of income eligible children participating in Head Start. But keep that 85% number in mind when you think about what our estimates sort of look. So we're going to measure Head Start exposure using Head Start spending. So we're going to look at Head Start spending in the individual child's county when they were 4 years old. So in order for a Head Start center to be established, some member within the community has to basically apply for a federal grant to install a Head Start center in their county. So if there's no Head Start center, there's $0 in that county. But once a Head Start center is established, we're going to see some positive amount of spending. And the more, I guess, the higher quality the Head Start center, in terms of the packages that it offers, we expect the spending levels to be higher. Again, we don't know this because we don't know exactly what was going on in each center in 1964 and 1965, but this is going to be our measure. So we're going to look at Head Start spending per income eligible child. The idea here is that this captures not necessarily how much is being spent per enrolled child, but it also captures to some extent how much is being spent per child in the target population. And you can imagine that looking at Head Start spending per enrollee is going to miss out on information on, say, a program that is rolled out and has a lot of children. That basically, you're losing the intensive margin by doing that. So by looking at Head Start spending per child, you're looking at potential increases on spending per kid who's enrolled, but also potential increases that expand the pool of poor children who are exposed to Head Start. Yeah.
So about that, so I live, I think, in Middlesex County.
I think you do.
And there are parts of Middlesex County I've never been to, so and particularly for young children, parents are really sensitive to distance in terms of whether or not presence of a center. Why do it by county? So if you've got address of the student from the PSID, why not try to match it closer to use some kind of proximity?
So for the child, we have a very good measure of location. For the spending, the lowest level that we have is a county.
Yeah, but the location of a center.
That again is not that well defined.
Yeah.
So so it's certainly possible in certain circumstances to get geocoded data for centers, but to get national data for all the centers, that's just not something we were able to do. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. So by the 1970s, the average county with a Head Start center spent about $2,000 per poor 4-year-old and about $300 per enrollee. So we're going to use Head Start spending at the county level per poor 4-year-old as our measure of exposure. And this is going to capture variation in both the scope and the quality, and it also accounts for changes in enrollment as well. And we're going to basically be living off geographic variation in the timing of the rollout of Head Start, and I'll show you what that's going to look like in a second. So this is just a map showing you the year of establishment of the first Head Start Center, and we've basically color-coded the various years, so you can sort of see that much of the map is sort of in this yellowish-brownish range. Essentially, most of the Head Start centers that are established, let me rephrase that. Most counties that have a Head Start Center, the year that the first Head Start Center was established in the county typically appeared between 1965 and 1970. So this is the year of establishment of the first Head Start Center. So if a Head Start Center entered in 1965 and in 1966, it would be coded as 1965 in the county. So we're going to use two approaches to identify the effective Head Start on outcomes. So the first approach is going to be essentially a difference in difference. So we're going to identify the effective Head Start spending by relating the difference in outcomes across birth cohorts from the same county to the difference in Head Start spending when these cohorts were 4 years old. So essentially we're going to compare cohorts that were exposed to Head Start and exposed to some positive level of spending to the outcomes of cohorts from the same county who were not exposed to Head Start and had $0 of spending. So the vast majority of this variation is going to occur at rollout. So obviously if you were 4 years old before Head Start was introduced in your county, you're unexposed. And if you turned 4 after Head Start was rolled out in your county, then you are exposed. So we're essentially comparing the outcomes of exposed cohorts to unexposed cohorts within the same county. So this is kind of an illustration of what the variation looks like. So let me just describe this graph for a second, because we're going to look at a few graphs that look like this. So year 0 is basically showing the cohort that was, I guess, 4 years old when Head Start was rolled out in their county. So these are individuals who are basically 5 years old, or I guess 3 years old at the time, 2 years old, etc. So these are individuals who are 4 years old or younger when Head Start rolled out in their county. Over here, these negative values are cohorts who were older than 5 at the time, so 5, 6, 7, 8. They should be unaffected by Head Start. So for these individuals, the dollar amount of Head Start spending per poor 4-year-old for those unexposed cohorts is 0, as you'd expect. And we basically break up the data into counties that spent a lot on Head Start in 1980 and counties that spent a little on Head Start in 1980. So the first thing that you're going to sort of look at is, as you'd expect, Head Start spending goes up for those exposed cohorts, as you'd expect. But the thing that's sort of somewhat strange is you say, well, why is it going up for those counties that spent a little in 1980? And the reason is that initial graph I just told you. Virtually every place had some kind of summer-only program, but then things sort of died out. So initially, we do see a jump even in those areas that did not spend a lot in 1980, but as we transition towards a sort of the full-year program, there's large differences between basically the high-spending areas and the low-spending areas. And you can see the drop here, even for the high-spending areas as well. So then the question is, if there is some impact of Head Start spending on outcomes, if we were to look not just at the per pupil, or I should say per income eligible child levels, but also look at outcomes, we should see some movement there as well. So the first panel is looking at the same exact cohort. So these are the cohorts who were too old at the time to be exposed to Head Start. These are the cohorts that were young enough to be exposed to Head Start. And this graph is showing you that same figure and looking at the educational attainment. See, these are now adult outcomes for children who came from counties who were either unexposed or exposed to Head Start and had low levels of Head Start spending. So you can see an initial increase in educational attainment, and it sort of drops down, and in most cases you cannot distinguish this effect from being different from the unexposed cohort. So if you're just asked, are the exposed cohorts doing better than the unexposed cohorts in those areas that did not increase Head Start spending by very much, and the answer is no. This figure over here is showing you the same figure, the analogous figure, for those counties that spent a lot on Head Start. So for these counties, we can see that the exposed cohorts are clearly doing much better than the unexposed cohorts. And the nice thing here is we don't really see any underlying pre-trending in the data. So it's not the case that places that were spending more on Head Start were already on a trajectory of improving outcomes. Things were looking pretty flat right up until Head Start rolled in, and once it came in, outcomes improved in places where Head Start spending was lower. So this is just kind of visually showing some evidence that the spending likely led to improved outcomes. So the basic model is going to be implemented in the difference in difference framework by estimating the following equation by ordinary least squares. So we have the outcome y, this is the outcome of the person from county C in birth cohort B. It's going to be a function of the amount, the level of Head Start spending when that individual was 4 years old in their county of birth. And then we introduce a bunch of controls, and then we have fixed effects for the county, fixed effects for the birth cohort, and we have a bunch of controls. So the key assumption here is a trend assumption. So the assumption here is that areas that spent more per child on Head Start were not on trajectories of improving outcomes or outcomes getting worse. The figure I just showed you suggests that was not the case. And then the second assumption is that there were no other changes that took place in these counties that can account for these improved outcomes. So it would be a problem if, let's say, every county that decided to introduce Head Start also decided to build a large public library. We would be confounding the library effect with the Head Start effect. And we're going to show you some tests that suggest that this is not driving the impact.
That you're running that only on the low-income children?
In this model, yes.
And do you ever use the high-income kids as
Yes.
a placebo test, or?
We don't use it as a placebo test because it's possible there could be spillovers. I will show you impacts for the high kid. You're just a big fat nothing. So that we find no effect of Head Start for high-income kids, which is good. And we see no evidence of complementarities for high-income kids either, which I think gets at this question of like, if it's something at the community level, you might see for the high-income kids. So we're going to show you later on, there's no impact for high-income kids who should be unaffected by this. And it's also the case that there's no impact for kids who are like literally 5 years old at the time, even among the poor kids. So among populations where you should not see effects, we really don't see anything. But that's exactly what we're going with.
And like, even if you could get locations of the Head Start centers just for a subset of your sample,
Right.
that would help with Josh's point, because that would, if there was no Head Start center anywhere near my part of Middlesex County,
Right.
you'd expect no effect on me. Like, so,
Right,
so
right,
it would just having, even if it's not for your full sample, just having for a subsample, the location thing would give you another placebo.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Having better data on the location of Head Start centers would be great. We'd have to think about how much data we're losing with the PSID, with national data. That would be possible, but I think that's something we're thinking about.
You could potentially make the assumption that the centers would tend to be located in population-dense parts of the county. I don't know if that's a safe assumption, but like you could just do a little bit of, our kids who are living farther away from other kids,
So one thing I would say is that we did. So when we first started doing this project, we actually played around with various ways to predict Head Start spending levels, other than just having the center. So we tried to interact the center with a bunch of things, and it turns out our intuition about what would predict it was totally wrong. So probably what most of you are thinking, because you haven't been thinking about it very long, would be that the areas that spent the most per kid were basically the more disadvantaged neighborhoods, and the more advantaged neighborhoods didn't have a center. Hence your comment about your area probably doesn't have a Head Start center. Turns out that's actually the opposite of what's true. It turns out that the areas that tended to spend more oftentimes were areas that were somewhat more affluent. So I think it sort of makes sense when you think about it. In order to have the center, you kind of have to have your act together to some extent. So there's part of that. So it's very difficult to categorize what's going on. And even when we did that, we couldn't get a decent first stage anyway. So many things that we think would predict spending levels or the timing of the establishment of a Head Start center really don't. Which is good for our story because we can say, it's random. But your basic point is well taken. I think maybe getting some better data, 30 minutes will help with that. All right. So those of you who've seen me speak before know I have another gear and I'm about to enter. Okay. So we're going to basically, the second way we're going to identify the effect of Head Start on outcomes is by comparing the outcomes of children who are exposed to unexposed. So one concern may be, well, places that spend more per child are fundamentally different from places that spend less per child. So what we can do is we can just throw out all the variation in spending entirely and just say we're just going to look at cohorts that are exposed and unexposed, and we're going to ignore any variation in how much they spend. And we're just going to use the fact that some cohorts are exposed and some cohorts are unexposed as an instrument for the level of Head Start spending. So that's what this model is. So this is the second model. This is sort of the instrumental variables model, where we instrument for the level of Head Start spending with whether a Head Start center existed in a child's county of birth when they were 4 years old. Okay, so what this is showing you now is we basically run a regression of the effects of a $1,000 increase in Head Start spending by the age at which that spending occurs. And what this is showing you here is that spending at age 4 predicts more years of education, spending at age 5 does not. Spending at age 2 does not, conditional on age 4. And this is showing you very similar question, which is saying, what's the effect of having a Head Start center? So having a Head Start center at age 4 is associated with improved years of education, but having a Head Start center at age 3, conditional on having one at age 4, does not predict anything. So this is basically telling you we're only seeing Head Start center effects or Head Start spending effects for those ages when you expect to see effects, and we see nothing for other ages. So this is also helping bolster the case that what we're documenting is not some weird community-based thing. It's something that's very age-specific, and that we're going to show you in a second. That's also specific to the income column as well. So the second sort of intervention we're going to look at is court-ordered school finance reforms. So in most districts prior to 1970, more than half of school spending came from local property taxes. Today that's probably closer to like 30% or 40%. And basically local property taxes are taxes raised on property, so high wealth areas tended to have a larger tax base with which to fund education, so that led to large disparities in spending between high wealth and low wealth areas, which often also tracked with high income and low income areas. So in response to that, many states basically had their local public education financing systems challenged in the courts, I should say, and in many cases the courts struck down the prevailing system and said you must change your school funding formulas to be more equitable. So we're going to use those changes, those court-ordered changes, as an exogenous shock to school spending. And the basic idea is that if you are a district in a state that had one of these reforms, and you were like a low wealth, low income, low spending district, you are exactly the kind of district that was very likely to experience a windfall of cash right after the passage of one of these court-ordered school finance reforms. Conversely, if you are one of those districts that was high wealth and high spending, you are likely to see either no additional money and potentially actually get less money the following year as they change the funding formulas. So we're going to basically use that information, and we're going to predict districts that are likely to see increases in spending at the passage of a court-ordered reform, or districts that are likely to see decreases in spending due to the passage of a court-ordered reform, and look and see what the outcomes look like for kids who are in those districts. So very, very briefly, so many of these things happened between 1970 and 2000. The first court-ordered school finance reform happened in 1972. And I'll just show you, and by 2005, about 23 states had one of these things. So it's pretty well documented that these court-ordered school finance reforms lead reduced inequality in spending. The question is, what impact did it have on outcomes? So not only does it matter if you have a court-ordered school finance reform, but the kind of funding formula that you introduce also matters. So what we do here is we basically classify the kind of funding formula that was introduced by the state after the court-ordered reform into basically 5 main types. So I'll breeze through them. So the first kind of plan is what we call a foundation plan. This is basically a plan that guarantees a base level of per pupil spending per child. So if the district spends below that, the additional money is basically given to the district to top it up. Other kinds of states introduce spending limits, which is not a good way to raise spending, but it is a good way to equalize spending. So you basically prohibit certain districts from spending a certain amount that is equalizing. Other areas implemented what are called reward for effort plans. These are plans that basically said, well, for every dollar that the local district raises to spend on education, we're going to match that with additional money from the state in low-income areas. So you go to low-income areas, if the low-income area raises $2 on taxes, they're going to give them an additional $1. So that also was a way to reduce inequality. And then finally, there were equalization plans that you could think of as essentially redistribution, taking from the wealthier districts and giving it to the lower-income districts. So what this is showing you here is sort of a plot of what happens to spending if you were basically a very high-spending district or a low-spending district prior to the passage of a court order reform, when they pass a court order, when they introduce a foundation plan. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but basically this is showing you that spending levels dropped in places that spent a lot, and they went up in places that used to spend a little. And we see a basic pattern here for equalization plans. If they implement a spending limit, you see spending levels drop much more dramatically for areas that spent a lot, which is what you'd expect, and they drop by a little in areas that did not spend very much before. In the areas that got reward for effort plans, those are places that basically top up what you raise, we see spending levels increase overall, whether you're high or low spending. This is showing you similar figures by district income, and I'll just focus. So what we're going to do in this paper is we summarize all of that complicated information about the kind of district by income, the kind of district by spending, and the kind of funding formula that was introduced by the court order reform, and we can say, well, if we know all this information and we know how school spending behaves in the face of these reforms, for every single district we can come up with a number that basically classifies it as being a district that is going to get a large spending increase or a small spending increase, based on its income level, its spending level, and the kind of court order reform that was implemented by the state. And that's what we do. So there are a lot of small details for that, but I will not go into, but basically that's the information we're going to use, and we're going to classify districts as basically put them into quantiles by dosage, basically high dose or low dose. And we're going to use this thing, so we're going to call this dose, and we're going to use that as an instrument for K through 12 spending. Okay, so this is showing you now kind of whether our dose measure actually predicts changes in K through 12 spending at all. So our outcome here on the y-axis is the natural log of K through 12 spending for each individual during their school age years. So between the ages of 5 and 17, we take what the school spending was on average across those years, and we take a log of it. So the interpretation here would be like a percentage change. So just like the previous figures, year 0 are going to be cohorts who are 17 years old at the time of the passage of a court order reform. These are cohorts who are 18, 19, 20, 21, etc. These are cohorts that were young enough to be exposed to the court order reform because they were of school going at the time. And what this is showing you is that in districts that have large predicted spending increases, K through 12 spending did indeed increase a lot for those exposed cohorts. For those districts that had small predicted spending increases, K through 12 spending increased somewhat, but not by much. The question is, does this track with outcomes? And that's what we show you over here. So for those same cohorts, we look at the years of completed education, and as you can see, there's no evidence of any pre-trending here in the data. And we see that the cohorts that were exposed to higher levels of K through 12 spending indeed experience improvements in years of education relative to their cohorts from the same district, but who were in school several years before. So this is again sort of visually showing you that the patterns in spending track pretty closely with the patterns in years of education.
And this linearity is sort of consistent with your story too. That like if the main thing that distinguishes those cohorts to the right of 0 is that the number of years they got exposed to.
Exactly. So yeah, so you see that these are basically kids who are 5 years old. They got it for the full 12 years. These guys are exposed. These guys over here, where we don't see much action, were like 16 years old at the time. Some of them may have dropped out originally. So that's exactly what you expect to see here at Pasco, precisely. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to basically run a regression where we have outcomes as a function of per pupil spending and the same set of controls as before. And now we're going to instrument for per pupil spending with the number of years that an individual was exposed to a school finance reform. That's going to be a number between 0 and 12. So it'll be, so 0 if you're unexposed, 1 if you were 17, 12 if you were 5 when it occurred. And we're going to interact that with dose. So were you exposed for a long period of time? And given the amount of time you're exposed to, was it a high dose or a low dose district that you lived in? And that's going to be our instrument. That's going to pick up the variation I just showed you visually. Like I said before, our spending measure is going to be the log of average spending across the ages 5 through 17. So it's going to be sort of an overall measure of the cumulative amount of K through 12 spending the child was exposed to during the school age years. Okay. So this is kind of showing you a similar thing to what I showed you before for Head Start. If you look at years of education attainment, and we look at spending during the ages of 5 to 17, and we do the same thing using the same actual instrument for years for spending due between the ages of 20 and 24. The key takeaway here is spending when you're in school matters for outcomes. Spending a few years after you leave school has no impact on outcomes. So this is also telling you that this is something about being in school. It's not a community-wide thing. Otherwise, you see impacts there as well. So our main objective is to identify the interaction between the two. So basically, there are going to be some counties that had Head Start, but were located in places that didn't have a school finance reform. And there's some places that had Head Start and worked. So that's going to allow us to identify the effect of having an increase in K-12 spending with and without Head Start. Conversely, there are also places that have a school finance reform that didn't have Head Start, and places that had a school finance reform where they did have Head Start. And that allows us to potentially identify the effects of an increase in K-12 spending or the impact of Head Start with and without a school finance reform. So because there's variation in these two things, and we basically document that the variation in these two things are basically independent of each other, we can identify the interaction between them. So this is just a table showing that these two policy instruments are unrelated to each other, which is very helpful. So this is just visual evidence, potentially, of this complementarity. So what we've done here is showing you the same exact figure, where over here we have the small spending increases, but this is a small spending increases without Head Start, small spending increases with Head Start. So when you have small spending increases, it looks as though, so the first thing is these are pretty noisy, but it looks like outcomes improve even with the small spending increases when you have Head Start, but if the small spending increases without Head Start have zero effect at all. This is showing you this, basically the analogous figure when you have large K-12 spending increases. Here, large K-12 spending increases with Head Start lead to much larger improvements than large increases in K-12 spending without Head Start. And the key thing here is these are equivalent increases in K-12 spending, but just the impact is much different when the place has Head Start versus not. So this is showing you visually evidence of complementarity. The impact of the K-12 spending is larger when there's Head Start, and the impact of Head Start is larger when it's coupled with increases in K-12 spending.
We thought of a 2-year running average.
I'm
I'm just looking at all of your plot studies.
Oh, I see. Certainly want to do that. Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it. Yeah. We're just being very upfront about it. We don't want to obfuscate variation with aggregation.
I was
but yeah, no, it's totally accurate.
You should put data points that have huge radii.
it just covers the whole thing.
Look up a lot and it'll go up.
There you go. Okay, so we're going to combine both models basically, and I'm just going to brace you. Like the equation is really ugly and complicated, but conceptually, I think the idea is very straightforward. We're going to interact Head Start spending with K-12 spending, and we're going to include Head Start spending and K-12 spending individually. All the instruments that we talked about are going to be interacted with each other, and those are going to be thrown into the first stage.
So it's like an orchestra then.
Yeah, something like that, or cacophony, depending on how you think about it. So there are a lot of moving parts, but I think conceptually we sort of understand that we have 3 endogenous variables, and we have several instruments, and we're using all the instruments for those things. So the interactions of the instruments are going to identify the interaction. The K-12 spending instruments are going to identify the K-12 spending effects, and the Head Start exposure instrument is going to identify the Head Start spending effect. Yeah.
Assume the following story. So I have a family that lives in a district that received Head Start, and they start learning the importance of education. The kids finish, and then they say, okay, we need to move to another place that have a high expenditure in education.
So I should have mentioned this before. So all of our variation is based on the individual's location at birth. So there's about 4% of our sample where we don't actually know the birth location, but for most of the population we know their birth, and we look at their address prior to any of these reforms. So these are all intention to treat from that perspective. Keep in mind, low-income families are not generally very mobile. They're mobile within an individual house, but they're not very mobile across districts and counties in general. But yeah, everything is intention to treat. We're not using any of the family's location decisions to infer this that occurred after these policies were rolled out. Okay, so I shudder to show that. So the interaction basically is going to be Head Start spending times per pupil spending. So in red, this is the difference in difference model. We have per pupil spending is instrumented for, the interaction is instrumented for, and these are basically fitted values from the first stage regressions. We're going to instrument for K-12 spending with the exposure variable and exposure times dose, like I said before. We instrument for the interaction with Head Start spending times exposure times dose, and Head Start spending times exposure. And this is going to be the model. And then our full model, where everything is instrumented for, is basically the same thing. The interaction is the same, but now we're going to instrument for Head Start spending also. So our instruments are going to be basically exposure is going to instrument for Head Start. Sorry, Head Start exposure instruments for Head Start. Head Start exposure times dose. Sorry, K through 12 exposure instrumented with dose, and school finance reform exposure. These are going to identify per pupil spending. And then the interaction is identified off the interactions of all of these instruments. Okay, so now we're going to squint and stare at these little numbers. No. So, actually, this was actually for a different purpose. The reason I showed this to you is that here we have Head Start spending, here we have K through 12 spending, and here we have the interaction between the two. What I really want to point out to you is that this is looking only at the population of poor children, is that we have a whole bunch of stars down here. That's all this is showing. So basically, in all our models, the interactions are statistically significant and go in the direction you'd expect. But I also find that looking at numbers like this, when you have interactions, kind of complicated. So I'm not going to show, well, you can see it, but I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to focus on this. So what I've done here is summarize these effects by looking at the impact of having access to Head Start under 3 scenarios. So this is the impact of having Head Start on the likelihood of graduating high school for a poor child when they're also exposed to a 10% increase in K-12 spending. This is the impact of having a Head Start center basically be established when K-12 spending does not change, or it's at the average, and this is when K-12 spending falls by 10%. And as you can see, these effects are not the same, and the reason I showed you the point estimate is that the interaction effect here is statistically significant, even though these error bars look like they are not super precise. But to put this into perspective, we're saying that having Head Start and increasing K-12 spending by 10% increases the likelihood that a poor child graduates from high school by about 15 percentage points. Now the error bars here are non-trivial, but this is a pretty big effect. Having Head Start when K-12 spending is 10% below the average, we identify the effect as positive, but we cannot actually rule out that it's 0. This is showing you the sort of the flip side, which is what's the effect of an increase in K-12 spending with and without Head Start. Increasing K-12 spending by 10% with Head Start increases the likelihood of graduating high school by 11%, and increasing K-12 spending by 10% without Head Start increases it by about 6.74%. So it's still positive, but the marginal impact is larger when you have Head Start. This is showing you the exact same thing for non-poor children, which you want to see.
Yeah, I mean, it might even be better to do like, I think you said poor was bottom 20%.
Yeah, bottom quartile, yeah.
Because the remaining 80% might still include a few, as you said.
It could.
So you can limit it to the top 20% and make that a super clean.
That's right.
Partly because of the spillover effect issue. Schools are so segregated by income that the top 20% of income kids are probably barely going to be in contact with the bottom.
That's fair. It'd be nice, and then maybe yeah, that's right. I mean, but even here,
Yeah, no, I mean, it still looks like
it's gone. But I totally take your point. Yeah. And then over here, so K-12 spending does improve outcomes for high-income kids. It's always important to highlight this. The marginal impacts are smaller, but increases in K-12 spending improve outcomes for high-income kids too. Or I should say non-poor children also. It just happens that the marginal impacts are stronger for poor kids. So this is showing you the same basic pattern for so now this is showing you the change in the probability of high school graduation. For poor children, this over here is basically what you just saw before. This is using the difference in difference variation, where we just use Head Start spending. This is using the Head Start exposure instrument model. So this is just showing you that our patterns are very similar whether we instrument for Head Start spending or not. The other thing that sort of jumps out at you is the point estimates tend to be larger, and the standard error bars are much larger. So we're losing precision, and the confidence interval starts to include estimates that I think start to, seem somewhat implausibly large. So for the most part, we're going to sort of focus on our more conservative estimates over here, rather than focus on these. And we basically run a bunch of tests, and we can rule out, basically, these two estimates are not statistically distinct from each other. So we kind of, in a Hausman test kind of method, focus on the more precise ones. But the takeaway here is the story does not change when you use either a source of variation, and this is showing you basically the effect of K-12 spending. Okay, now we're just going to go through a few outcomes. So this is the pattern effects when we look at change in the years of education. Here, things are a little more precise because we no longer have a binary outcome. So this is showing you that basically having Head Start and increasing K-12 spending by 10% increases years of education by about 0.6 years for poor children. Down here, if you look, but it doesn't seem to be having much of an effect if Head Start without, or if Head Start with a 10% decrease in K-12 spending, you see sort of no impact of Head Start. Increasing K-12 spending by 10% with Head Start increases years of education by about 0.4 years. Without Head Start, it's much smaller, by about 1/10 of a year, and it's not statistically significant. Again, this is showing you the effects over here for children who are not poor. We see no gradient here at all, and we see that K-12 spending matters for these children, but it is not, the impact of Head Start for these children does not vary. So the impact of K-12 spending for these children does not vary by Head Start, which is what you'd expect if Head Start is not having an impact on these higher income children. This is showing you the wage. So having Head Start and a 10% increase in K-12 spending, earnings for poor children are about 17% higher. But having Head Start with a 10% reduction in K-12 spending, the impact on wages is pretty small and cannot be distinguished from zero. A K-12 increase in K-12 spending of 10% with Head Start basically increases wages by about 20%. Without Head Start, it's about 13%. This is showing you the same figure here for children who are not poor. For children who are not poor, we see nice impacts here on the wage, but the impact of K-12 spending does not vary by Head Start exposure, and it's hovering here about 7%, basically. So it's a meaningful impact even for the non-poor children as well. So everyone should like increased K-12 spending. So this now is looking at incarceration. So this is kind of a new result. We never looked at incarceration in our previous paper that looked at K-12 spending on its own. So here we see that the likelihood of being incarcerated basically falls by about 4 percentage points if you have Head Start exposure and a 10% increase in K-12 spending. But Head Start on its own, Head Start with no increase in K-12 spending, or Head Start with a 10% reduction in K-12 spending has no impact. To put this into perspective, the base rate for low-income children in our data is somewhere around 6%. So this is a pretty big marginal impact here in relative terms. And then K-12 spending, increasing K-12 spending by 10% with and without Head Start. Basically, we're talking about 8% with Head Start and 6% without Head Start. Again, we don't see anything for children who are not poor, and this is also true even for K-12 spending. So K-12 spending on its own does not reduce the likelihood that a non-poor child is incarcerated. Part of the reason for that is that these children are much less likely to be incarcerated at all. So part of it is just they're just not on the margin to be impacted by this. And then finally, this is sort of like being poor, kind of breaking the cycle of poverty. The likelihood of being poor falls by about 12 percentage points if you have Head Start and you're exposed to a 10% increase in K-12 spending. And it falls to a much smaller number, about 3 or 4%, if you have Head Start and you are exposed to a 10% reduction in K-12 spending. And again, the base rates here are about, I think it's maybe 20%. So this is a relative risk reduction of about half. It's a pretty big marginal impact for poor children. And we don't really see any action here for children who are not poor, or who were not poor as children. Okay, so we do a few additional tests. How am I doing on time? No. So we do a few additional tests. We estimate models that use sibling estimates, so we compare the exposed sibling to the unexposed sibling, and the results are basically very similar. We look at predicted outcomes. We don't see any impact there. We ask whether the improvements are driven by improvements in parent quality, as we talked about earlier, looking at what happens to the outcomes of the older sibling when the younger sibling is exposed. We don't see any impacts there. So this suggests it's not something about a family improvement situation. We also examine with our data, so again, this is super imprecise, but the patterns are suggestive that the interaction effect is stronger when the school finance reform occurs closer to preschool. So the school finance reform happens after an individual was, I think, 12. There's very little evidence of an interaction effect. But if it happens before the age of 12, closer to the preschool year ages, we see a stronger impact. So I think this is sort of consistent with this alignment story. If it's truly alignment, we should see stronger interactions between, say, like kindergarten, basically, and pre-K spending. And the evidence is supportive of that, but not strongly so, because we don't have enough precision to really rule out both of these. Okay, so the last thing I'll say in the last few minutes is that, so we sort of did a thought experiment. We said, well, if you thought about spending in the education sector more holistically, and instead of having, Head Start funded federally and public K-12 schools funded from state and local sources, we just sort of said we have money and we're going to allocate it in a way to maximize outcomes. If we're going to do that, ideally what you want to do, if you think about it through the context of the way sort of economists think about money, is for every dollar that you spend, the benefit that if we're maximizing outcomes, the benefit that we get in terms of aggregate outcomes should be the same if I spent it on Head Start than if I spent it in the K-12 system. If I could have gotten better outcomes by spending $1 in the K-12 system, it means I should take money away from Head Start and spend it in the K-12 system until those two things are equal. Once they're equal, I can no longer increase average outcomes by reallocating money across the two sectors. So we'll basically do a thought experiment with our data, and I'll just zoom into the figure to show it to you. So what we're going to do here is we computed the ratio of the impact of increasing increasing Head Start spending by $1, or spending that same money in the K-12 system. And we did it under a few different scenarios. So first, we basically took the estimates from our model if we shut down the dynamic complementarity piece. So if you shut down dynamic complementarity, and we basically plotted this ratio for different poverty rates for the county. What we find here is that on average, these 3 bars are for places that spent 10% below average on K-12. This is for places that spent 10% above average in K-12. Without dynamic complementarity, these lines are basically on top of each other, and they all hover close to 1, which is kind of saying, if you look at average levels of spending, it looks as though $1 in a Head Start would give you the same bang for your buck as $1 spent in the K-12 system, which sounds like they're being optimal. But if you allow for the possibility that when you spend more on Head Start, your K-12 dollars become more productive, i.e. complementarity, this figure changes dramatically. So this over here is showing you what the pattern looks like if we allow for dynamic complementarity, and over here what this is showing you is if you take a district that spent 10% below average in the K-12 system, for them it would have been optimal almost at any poverty level to spend less on Head Start and more in the K-12 system. And over here, for districts that were spending 10% above average, well, first of all, 10% above average in the K-12 system, $1 in Head Start would have given them about 3 times the bang than $1 spent in the K-12 system. So this is the point I made earlier where I said, potentially if you have these dynamic complementarities, you could take money from these high spending districts, spend it on Head Start, and overall outcomes would actually be better, and you also at the same time improve equity. And this is also true even if you're spending at the average. So based on our calculations, based on average levels, this is also true. The ratio of the marginal impact of spending in the Head Start was always greater than that in the K-12 system. So this is basically telling us that based on the levels of K-12 spending and Head Start spending that prevailed in the 70s, we were probably underinvesting in the skills of underprivileged children. And we could have actually improved average outcomes in the aggregate sense by taking money away from some of the higher spending K-12 districts and spending it on Head Start. Okay, so to conclude, we find significant complementarities between policies to promote early childhood education and K-12 school quality. I should just be very clear that we don't know that this is going to generalize to all human capital interventions. It's entirely possible that if you looked at food stamps and K-12 spending, you would not find anything. We actually examined that and we didn't find anything. So we find the effects of Head Start are small when public K-12 spendings are low. We think our impacts basically provides some suggestive evidence to explain the fade-out effects that we tend to see in the data. It also provides an explanation for why we tend to see that Head Start impacts tend to be larger for families that are relatively more advantaged among the poor. Our results sort of speak to that as well. I'm working with some researchers to try and actually test that directly using test score data. K-12 spending is more effective at improving outcomes with low-income children when it's preceded by Head Start. Finally, based on the levels that prevailed in the 70s, it appeared that we were doing relatively well in terms of allocating money to these pre-K programs if you ignored the importance of dynamic complementarity. But once you allow for the possibility that your spending in the K-12 system might be better or have a larger bang for you get a larger bang for that buck if you spend in the K-12 system, the estimates suggest that we were basically underfunded in the compensatory pre-K system.
So I just wanted to thank you both for the seminar. I'm sure people may have some additional questions. There's a reception outside for the next like 15 minutes or so, and then Bo and the PIER fellows were going to